Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we're jumping into something super practical and important. How to run SQL queries using EntityManager in Spring Boot. So far, we've used EntityManager mainly with JPQL, Criteria Builder, or by calling standard methods like persist, find, and merge. But what if you want to execute a raw SQL query, like a native select, insert, or even a complex join, using EntityManager? Well, that's exactly what we're going to learn today. Let's jump right in. We'll create a method called findByEmployeeID using SQL that fetches an employee by their ID using a SQL query. First, we'll write our SQL query. It's a simple select. Now here's the cool part. EntityManager provides a method called createNativeQuery, which lets us run raw SQL queries. We just pass in our SQL string and the entity class type we want to map the result to. Pass in our SQL string and the entity class type employee.class. Next, we'll bind the value of employee ID using the setParameter method. And finally, call getSingleResult to execute the query. This method returns a generic object. Since we know it's going to be an employee, we need to cast it before returning. Now let's call this method from our controller. Alright, now that we've made all the changes, let's go ahead and restart the application. Now let's hit the API. See, we got a proper response from the API. All the employee details are coming through just as expected. Alright, now let's take a look at how to perform SQL insert or update operations using EntityManager. The good news? It's almost exactly the same as the select query, just a couple of small differences. Let's walk through it together. First, we'll create a new method to insert a new employee into the database using native SQL. Now, write a SQL insert query. Next, use EntityManager.createNativeQuery, just like before. Now let's set all the parameters one by one. First, we'll set the employee name. Next, we'll set the age. Then we set the joining date. And finally, the department. And now, since this is an insert or update query, we don't use getSingleResult here. Instead, we call the executeUpdate method to actually run the SQL command. Add a transactional annotation above on this method. Now let's quickly create a REST API for this method so we can call it and test it. Next, we'll call the insertEmployee using SQL method, the one we just created. Return the actual employee object. Start the application. Now let's test our new API and insert a new employee record using Postman. See, the employee got inserted successfully and we received a proper response. But if you look closely, you'll notice something important. The employee ID in the response is showing as 0. That's because we haven't yet handled the logic to fetch the auto-generated ID after insertion. So we'll come back and improve that later. Now let's quickly open dbeaver or your database client and check the employee table. And yup, here it is. Our new employee record is inserted in the database correctly with an auto-generated ID. So everything is working as expected. Alright, now let's improve this and fetch the auto-generated employee ID after insertion. If you're using MySQL, you can simply use the SQL query to get the last inserted ID. Select last_insert_ID. Just like you can see on my screen right now. This query gives us the ID that was auto-generated in the same session where we ran the insert query, and that's exactly what we need here. One important thing to remember here. This query only works in MySQL. If you're using a different database, like PostgreSQL, Oracle, or SQL Server, this query won't work. The syntax and approach to fetch the last inserted ID is completely different. Alright, now let's execute this query using EntityManager. This query will return the auto-generated ID, and its return type will be a number object, so we'll need to cast it properly. So here we're casting the result to number, and from that, we can easily get the long value of the ID. Now we can use this generated ID and set it in our employee object. Alright, we've updated our code to fetch the auto-generated ID. Now let's start the application again and test everything end to end. Hit our Insert API again. You can see here, Rahul Kumar was inserted successfully, and the API response shows the ID as 69. Now let's quickly switch to dbeaver and verify this directly in the database. And yep, here it is. Rahul Kumar is present in the employee table with ID 69. So everything is working perfectly: the insert, the auto-generated ID fetch, and the response mapping. All done using native SQL with EntityManager. One important thing to note here: even though we successfully used native SQL queries with EntityManager, if you're planning to write a lot of raw SQL, I personally recommend using JDBC template instead. Why? Because JDBC template is designed specifically for working with SQL. It gives better control, simpler syntax for insert/update operations, and it's often easier to manage result mappings manually when you're not using JPA. Alright, let's quickly recap what we did today. We learned how to run native SQL queries using EntityManager in Spring Boot. We covered both select and insert operations, and we also saw how to fetch the auto-generated ID after insertion. Then we tested everything using Postman and verified the data in the database using dbeaver. This approach is useful when you need more control over your SQL and JPQL doesn't quite fit. Now, if you found this video helpful, do hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any updates. And feel free to leave a comment below if you have any questions or suggestions. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.